Alright, so it's a little warm right now. We're skinning the critters we caught on the trap line, a nice 35-pound beaver. But we figured we'd put it back in the freezer for a little bit and let it stay cool while we let this warm weather pass. Warmth rots pelts really quickly, especially if you haven't, especially when you're trying to do a clean skin where there's not a lot of meat on the flesh or not a lot of meat on the hide and no holes in the hide. You're going nice and slow. You want a lot cooler weather. This is right now about 18, 20 degrees Celsius. But I was looking at the wood pile and I saw some scrap bark. So I ran inside real quick and grabbed my little shears here. I figured I'd show you really nifty, simple couple of bark crafts you can do with birch bark. It's a very flexible material, and these aren't going to be really nice, elegant baskets. These are going to be some very simple crafts that you can practice on to get better. Now this one's got a bit of an eye here, so it's going to be a little bit of a struggle, and I can already see a split happening. I'm going to put him aside, or her aside. This is not bad. It's going to be a little smaller, but we can work with this. I'm going to just cut a square. And this is just going to be a very simple folded cut. Yeah, that's some nice bark. So, kind of using my scissors as a gauge. I can look at the straight line. As you can see on this side, you can use the scissors to help show you where the square is. That looks a little bit past square, but I also want to snip and trim that side up. So let's go about there. So, cut straight across. You can do this with a knife. You can, if you really want to go all out, you can do this with a knife. I've just been playing with bark for a long time, especially birch bark, playing with it since I was a kid. I've got aunties that make birch bark baskets. They do beautiful quill work on it. They sell them at the craft stores here in the reserve. Or sell them online as well. I've learned how to do it. I'm not a very good quill worker. That's close to square. It's a little stiff in the center. There's ways you can make it easier to flex. Run it over a candle real quickly, just over the flame. Put it in warm water, not hot water, warm water. Or you can just delaminate. This is a little easier when you're outside without a fire. You can just delaminate. Take off a couple layers. And you want to make sure you get all that layer off. This side you can see the tone in the bark. There's a bit of a angled piece here that's a little thicker. So I'm very careful. I can actually lift that layer up without damaging the rest of the bark. I'm just going to go very slow and steady. There we go. There's that piece off. And now it's a little bit more flexible. I could make it even thinner if I wanted to, but this is about the stiffness I like for birch bark for folding. So we've got a close to square, as close as it really needs to. This is the inside of the bark, this is the outside of the bark, as it was growing on the tree. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this diagonal, so that corner is going to touch this corner. The way I do that is I brace these two corners where the fold is going to be, and I just start to pinch with my thumbs and middle fingers, very slowly, very calmly. I don't want to cause any splits in the bark. Touch the tips together, slowly start to flatten it with my thumbs and my finger pads. Bring them close, and when they're very close, the best way to pinch it down shut, just give it very gentle biting. That's where, in my opinion, where birch bark biting originated, was clamping bark down and seeing a little pattern forming. Now what I'm going to do is I got a little triangle there, two corners right there. That's going to be the top of our cup. These two sides have to be folded up. The way I do that is, you see a nice top up here. I want to take this side of this triangle and make a flat line across. So what I'm going to do is bring it up. Again, very slow, very steady. I'm going to do that. So now this side has been folded in and has a straight line across there. Again, I got a little tube right there where the fold is. Very gently squeeze and then very slowly bite it down flat. I repeat that on the other corner. So they're both in there like that. Starting to look almost like a French fry box from fast food joints. And I would know. So I still have those two top corners here. Well, I'm going to split them in half by putting my fingers in between the two corners. I'm going to fold one side up and back, clamp it down, and then I'm going to take the other corner, fold it down and back, if I had the cup facing me, pinch them, and you want to go very slow when you're first working with the bark. You want to ease it because you'll do what I just did and rip it. But there is a very simple little drinking cup. You can make them much bigger. I make them at the camp. I usually get a sheet of bark about 10 inches to 12 inches or 30 centimeters long by 30 centimeters long or a foot by a foot. Fold it over, make nice big cups for making cedar tea, sumac-ade, anything like that. The other little craft I want to show with birch bark was the one thing that I constantly found myself without, because I usually am that guy that packs the night before I go out in the bush. And because of that, I often will forget an item or two. Usually the item I forget is a spoon. Just the way it is. And by the time we get around to dinner, it's usually getting closer to dark. And by the time I realize I don't have the spoon, it's like 5 minutes before supper. And because of that, we're just here behind the house working at the skinning shack, waiting for this car to go by. Oh, it's a backhoe. Okay. Because of that, I realized that, yeah, I can carve spoons. That's not a problem. I got moktagans, I got carving knives, I got my bush knife. But it takes at least, if I want to go quick, it takes a few minutes. Usually about 5 for me to make a spoon that's eatable. Then one day, about, I don't know, 2008, I had this idea in my head. I was playing with some birch bark, teaching some kids how to make very simple birch bark baskets, kind of like that cup. That was just a very simple primer practice. And I had a strip of bark like this, and we're sitting there waiting for the soup to finish being cooked, and I forgot my spoon. And I sat there and I was just kind of looking at the bark, and I'm not saying I invented this by any means. I'm sure somebody else has done this before. I'm just saying I didn't learn it from anybody. I figured it out on my own. I haven't seen pictures of it anywhere. Albeit I've never really heavily searched for it because I only do it once in a while. But what you want is a strip of bark, fairly stiff. Doesn't have to be very thin like the other one. It doesn't have to be very thick either. You can work with pretty much any nice clean strip of fairly flexible birch bark. And what we're going to do is we're going to carve. We're not going to carve, we're going to cut. I'm going to cut the shape of a spoon with a very long handle. So, with birch bark, you don't want to take your scissors in. You want to go with the grain, and it's almost like carving. That's kind of where I get caught with you saying birch bark carving a lot. Is I'm going to bring it in from the outside, working with the grain of the bark. I'm going to snip that side. I'm going to bring this in a little thinner. And this time I'm actually going to go around and try to round this off a little bit better. I like to have a very round front on the spoon. It seems to not come to a weird funky point as much. We make it have a nice round nose, very wide round nose. This is fairly wide for the length of the spoon, so I'm probably going to narrow it down a bit. So I'm going to look at it, and it's all about the aesthetics at this point. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go against my rule about going with the grain. Yeah, that looks better. So I'm going to go about that distance. So I've cut the shape of my bowl of my spoon. I'm just going to taper it fairly rapidly. And then make a nice long handle. Now at this point I could actually just take the bark and peel that off. You want to save one of these. Take the other one, taper it in fairly rapidly, and then again snip down. Once you got a line figured out, do that. There's your spoon. But it isn't going to be a very good spoon for eating with. However, we're going to take one of these. Remember how I saved that guy, and it's got a bit of a taper on this point, which is going to work with how I want to use it. So I'm going to snip it very thin, about oh, the width of the tip of my little finger, the width of my fingernail on my little finger. That's usually wide enough. This is going to be our binding material for the very end. And again, I'm going to take my bark, I'm going to fold it very slowly. I'm already hearing some cracking down here. That doesn't really matter. I just don't want the bowl to split. I'm going to fold it down the length of the handle. Usually I start right at the bowl, very carefully. Hearing a little bit of splitting on that lenticule, these lines in the bark. On birch bark has what's called lenticels. And these are fairly wide ones. These are not what you would want to use for nice baskets. This is not what you would want to use for a birch bark canoe by any means. But they are good enough for simple little crafts like this. I want to keep the lines fairly straight. And now I just take my fingers as like creasing or folding bark, folding paper for origami. We nicknamed this Ojibwe origami once as a joke. And on that tip of the handle, the end of the handle of the spoon, I'm going to just taper it at about a 45, yeah, about that distance, or about that angle. And then I figure out where the halfway point is, and I fold this back, like that. That's why I have it on an angle, so it sits under the spoon, like that. Take this, and remember the original fold? Put this side here, inside that fold, clamping it, so it hangs out right in the middle of my bowl with my spoon, right here. And I just go back on it, and I start to wrap around my handle. This is not a very fancy one. This is just something that's quick and dirty to make a spoon for when you're out in the bush and you forget your spoon. So I got it wrapped up almost all the way. I've got this nice long taper. So what I do is I loosen this, kind of like whipping. And I fold it up inside, tuck it up inside, sorry there. I'm going to use the right language here, tuck it up inside rather than fold it. Clamp that, grab it. And I'm going to do ventriloquism. Not really moving my lips. And there we go. Just tell you on that with my teeth. And easing the folds into their crease, and then snip that off. Now I'm going to look at it. I see a bit of a corner here. And trim that from the outside. And there is a very simple spoon. It's kind of a scooping spoon, so it's actually really good for making, for if you're cooking like ravioli or anything like that when you're out at camp, or chili. It's a nice scoop. Not the perfect spoon for soup, because it's going to want to spill out, but like a stew or a chili or pasta, this is a good little spoon. And you even have a little loop to hang it off of, or you can tie a string to it and wear it around your neck. Some guys like to wear their spoons right around their necks, so they always got their spoon. That actually should be something I try out, so I stop losing spoons and end up having to make these all the time. Again, I first figured that out probably in 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. And I've just been doing them once in a while. Figured I'd show you guys a very simple one. This is a little bit more of a success than that folded cup, but there you go. Folded spoon, made of bark.